Hi lads, today I said I'd start the nervous system. Okay, so I'm going to try and break up this chapter because there's quite an awful lot in it. A lot of it's new, unfamiliar, and there's a lot of terms that you need to learn off as well. So we're going to break it up today, tomorrow, and Friday. Okay. So before you start this chapter, you have probably skimmed through the video I have sent you on the nervous system, and the main message there was that, you know, when we talk about messages being sent around the body, we're really talking about messages being carried by impulses. Okay, it's like electricity. So we're going to refer here to conductors, insulators. We won't necessarily talk about resistance, but um, we're certainly going to be talking about like impulses being conducted around the body, okay, carried along the body. And we're going to talk about insulation as well, where just like we have cables have insulation to make sure the electricity stays within the cable, we have our own nerve cells with their own insulation to make sure that the impulse is carried efficiently around the body. So, what kind of background knowledge would I expect that you'd have on this? Well, I would expect you to know that there's such a thing called a response and a stimulus, and to be able to define both of those. So, a response is like how we react to a stimulus, okay, the way that an organism reacts to a stimulus. So, for example, again, when you sweat, that is a response to the heat of the environment. So the heat would be the stimulus, and the body, undergoing all of those processes to lose heat to the environment is the response. The stimulus, as I said, is the heat. So a stimulus is like the way organisms, what brings about that response. Okay, so the stimulus is what brings about a response. Then the next thing then is the nervous system, and it's classified into two major parts. So you might remember from junior cert that you learned off the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So for short, we call that the CNS and the PNS. So the CNS, the central nervous system, central meaning that it has the main parts. So we have the brain and the spinal cord, will be both part of the central nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system is basically everything else. So we will be referring here to, things like neurons. Okay, all of the neurons that branch around the body are part of the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral, we'll be looking at that word later as well. What is the role of the nervous system? So effectively, if you're asked this question on an exam situation, you are being asked like, what is the role of the brain effectively, and the spinal cord. So what's it do? What does the brain do for us? Well, we have short-term and long-term memory. Okay, that would be one of the main things that comes to mind. Okay, so right now maybe this is entering your short-term memory, but making sure that it enters your long-term memory. You're going to study this. You have perception. So we're talking like in the previous chapter when we looked at eyesight, we talked about depth perception, and having two eyes helps with depth perception and having a field of vision. So being able to perceive the environment around us is part of our nervous system. Then we have just like cognitive thinking, or often called cognition. So cognition is like the active thinking. So like if you're planning out your day to day, that's part of your cognition. So the role of the nervous system is to make us effectively sentient beings, which means that we are able to think and take actions, and we have a full kind of understanding of what we're doing around us. The next thing then is like the kind of actions that the nervous system can do, and that means that our bodies are attuned to like do voluntary and involuntary responses. So voluntary would be like you choosing to do something, like for example you choosing to go swimming, whereas an involuntary response would be like you have no choice in it. So the classic example always is like, you touching a hot kettle and removing your hand because, it's too hot. So that's really kind of the main background stuff that I'd expect that you would know at this stage. And now we're just going to look at a few of these main things in detail. So if we talk here about the central nervous system, as I mentioned earlier, I said, okay, the central nervous system, we have the spinal cord, which runs down here your back, along your spine, and you have your brain then as well, which is in your head, obviously. Now, when we come to the skeleton, we'll be talking about how that's all protected, but you're probably aware that your brain is protected by your skull, and your spinal cord is protected by your spine and your bones and your back. Okay, so the central nervous system, anyway, as I said, you have your brain and your spine. Okay, and then you have your peripheral nervous system, as I said, is just all the different branches really that kind of come off of that. So any branches that are represented in diagrams today that come off of the spinal cord and the brain are your peripheral nervous system. Now, the way to remember that maybe is that the peripheral means like kind of in the periphery means like kind of in the distance or far away. So you know I would say here the peripheral nervous system anyway is made of nerve cells, and from now on we're just going to call them neurons. So there are different types of neurons here, but they all branch off the brain and the spinal cord, going to our extremities, which would be like the outside of our bodies. So like we have as we said, we have sensory receptors, which are a type of neuron found, in different parts of our bodies. We've seen those already, like for example, thermoreceptors, which detect heat. Like we have thermoreceptors, and in our skin, we have chemoreceptors in our tongue and our nose. We have, geez, what am I missing? So we have thermoreceptors. We have chemoreceptors, we have mechanoreceptors, which causes hair follicles to stand upright. So there's lots of different types of neurons around the body, and they would just be example of sensory receptors there, which are just one type of neuron. Okay, so together we would say that the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system make up the actual nervous system. Now, one question that you could be asked here would be like, what does the nervous system actually do? And we've more or less answered this already. I said that the brain is involved in cognition. So like active thinking and learning are parts of, being, a sentient being, as I mentioned. So cognition, cognitive thinking, COGNITIVE, thinking. Then we have, short-term and long-term memory are also a second one you could mention, and then just perceiving our world around us would be another thing you can talk about there that the nervous system does. Okay. So I suppose if we look at this, perception comes into processing information, making voluntary decisions, and involuntary actions as well. There's two things I forgot to mention there, but like as I said, involuntary actions there, like it's important to be able to respond like instantly, and this kind of comes into your fight or flight response that we'll be looking at later. But so the involuntary actions, like say for example, again go back to the classic example of you walking down the street, a car beeps the horn, you hear a loud noise, and your the stimulus is the loud sound, and your response is maybe you jump or you turn backwards looking towards the sound. And that would be an involuntary action. You kind of do it without thinking. Okay, you don't tell yourself, let's look around and see what's going on. You kind of react to it without really thinking, and that would be an involuntary action. So, first definition of the day: a neuron is a nerve cell, and it's a quite simple definition there. Just a neuron is a nerve cell. Now, this is a better diagram here of our central nervous system highlighted in green, so our spinal cord and our brain. These are called cranial nerves because the cranium is basically the head up here for the skull. Okay, so the cranium would be part of your skull. Then you have the peripheral nervous system highlighted in blue, which is more or less everything else, as I said, the branches that come out of here. So this is probably not a very good representation of it, that there are, branches that go all the way through your body. Like, it's huge network of cells that are around your body. So all of these, again, as we said, responds to stimuli, and we have responses, and then we'll be talking later about this stimulus response pathway and what that's all about later. Okay. So if we talk about 3 other examples of stimuli and responses, could you think of those yourself? So if we think about like all of the different senses, like for example, like the sense of smell. Okay, so the stimulus could be like, for example, you're up here studying and you smell the dinner, so that is your stimulus. The stimulus is the smell of food that has kind of alerted your chemoreceptors in your brain, or chemoreceptors in your nose rather, that there's food ready to go. Your response might be then that you go downstairs and you eat your food. Okay, so that would be one example. Or if you talk about an involuntary action there, that you actually turn your nose towards the sense of smell to get a better smell of what it actually is. Okay. Then we have a sense of touch. Okay, so the stimulus could be like, for example, someone has touched you on the shoulder and automatically your response would be to turn around to face the person. A third one might be like, for example, let's say, for example, a dog or something is barking violently, and you kind of back off. Then your response is you moving backwards, and that's kind of kicking into your fight or flight response. So you're fleeing from the situation, so you're moving backwards. So the stimulus is the aggressive dog. Okay. So that's all the nervous system so far, and there's so many examples we could talk about here. Like, for example, when we looked at excretion recently, we looked at like, again, excretion, we're talking about the removal of waste products of metabolism. When you sweat, that is a response there to the heat of the environment around you. So just think about what's actually involved there. You have, just as revision again, say now you have suddenly started exercising, the heat is building up in your body, so your now blood temperature might be going slightly above 37 degrees. You have sensory receptors, thermal receptors in your skin, which send a electrochemical message to your brain, and then your brain has to bring about a response. So its response might be, if you're very hot, that your hair follicles stand upright, that vasodilation happens. Vasodilation, which is where your blood vessel goes closer, your blood vessel network goes closer to the skin to release more heat more quickly. And then as well, the sweat pores, you start excreting sweat from your sweat pores to try to cool your body down. Okay, and that would be the response then of your body. So that would be like more like, multiple responses going on there in response to the stimulus, which is the heat. So you all saw this video anyway, and you know that a nerve, that really all of the actions that we have in our body, like thinking, memory, like any sort of voluntary or involuntary action, is as a result here of nerve impulses being carried around their brain. And that's why we often see like images here of just like electricity in our bodies, because technically that's what it is. We're talking about currents being carried around our body, and we can actually measure this in volts. Okay, the amount of voltage in our body. So when we talk about the previous example there of like, a person being really hot and responding to the stimulus, which was the heat, what we really talked about here, and you might come across these kind of steps here, is the sensory input. So the sensory system picks it up. So we talked about the sensory system, like the eyes. So the sensory system, like, maybe let's look at another example that's not heat. Let's look at light. So your sensory system, you're walking into a dark room, your sensory system, which is your photoreceptors in your eyes, detect that it is dark or dim. So therefore your rods, which are your photoreceptors in your retina, they pick up that it's darker, and they cause your pupil to dilate. That's the response that's brought about. They do that after integration has happened, which is where this message, electrochemical messages, send through the optic nerve of your eye to your brain. And the question that your brain asks itself to do is, what should I do? Now, obviously, um, you don't think about that yourself, but what's really happening there um, is like a chemical response there in the body, okay? And then you have a motor output, and the motor output is the action that's taken. So a motor would suggest like a physical kind of response. So like whether it's your eyes, pupils dilating, or your skin is sweating, there's some sort of physical response there that's happening. Okay, so before we start, the main things that we have looked at so far, we've looked at the fact there is nerve impulses being carried around the body. They are electrochemical messages because they involve both the movement of electricity and the movement of chemicals to carry this message from point A to point B. Okay, point B would be in your brain if we're talking about sending the message to your brain. And that these electrochemical messages are going to be carried along nerve cells known as neurons. Okay, so that's what we've looked at so far. Now, when we talk about electricity, I mean, for physics students there, you might know that electricity effectively is like where we have electrons moving between ions, and ions are just charged atoms. Okay, so that's the fundamental way that electricity works. You have a conductor, okay, and material and atoms which are lose their electrons very easily, and they pass the electrons from one atom to the next and to the next, etc. for causing electricity. Now, so if we talk about the nervous system as well, so far we've looked at the fact there's a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system. So now we're just looking at what the nervous system, if we talk about the different neurons here that make up these two systems, what we're talking about really are two that are likely very familiar: motor neurons and sensory neurons. Okay, and the third one then you wouldn't have come across, which is called an interneuron. Now, an interneuron suggests between. So, an interneuron would connect a motor neuron to a sensory neuron. So, it's, I suppose, if you talk about blood vessels, it's almost like, when we talk about blood vessels, you have the veins, the venules, the capillaries, the arterioles, the arteries. So, like, there's connections there between the veins and the arteries. In the same way as you need connections here between a motor neuron and a sensory neuron, and that is caused by the interneuron. So, if a stimulus is detected at the skin, which of the neurons is going to carry the impulse to the CNS? So, well, you're going to have a number of neurons here involved, but messages being carried here from the skin to the brain. You're really going to be talking here about sensory neurons primarily involved there. Okay, having carried the message. Now, unfortunately, this beautiful picture here, you will actually have to be able to draw this on your Leaving Cert, and it's not actually as complicated as it first looks. Okay, so this here is a motor neuron, and a motor neuron is can be recognized that it's a motor neuron by the fact that its cell body, which is well, we'll talk about that in a second. Its cell body is located at either the left or the right of the overall cell. So this is a cell. Remember, a nerve cell, a motor neuron. Now, it doesn't look like a traditional cell, which is like where we have, if we're talking about an animal cell, we're talking about that kind of rounded blob, effectively, with a nucleus in the middle. This is a nerve cell, a specialized nerve cell, where with specialized, I suppose, organelles to carry those nerve impulses that we were talking about. So, what do we find here? The cell body here is kind of what where we would find the traditional parts of the cell. Like the traditional parts would be the nucleus. You can see the nucleus represented here. You would find things like ribosomes and mitochondria because just like every other cell, it needs the ribosomes to produce protein. It needs the mitochondria to produce ATP for it. Um, but it also contains some unusual parts as well that kind of come out of this. Like we do have cytoplasm as well. Sorry, I forgot to mention that cytoplasm in here. But the unusual parts that you have coming out of this are the dendrons and the dendrites. Okay, so they're like branches. And I suppose the best way to think about this is like, remember when we studied like the lungs and we looked at like the bronchioli and the bronchus? Well, if you look here, the dendron would be effectively the same as the bronchus, like a sort of a big branch, a big thick branch, and then it branches into littler bits, which would be the equivalent of the bronchioli. Okay, so in the same way, every motor neuron has a dendron, which are like these big kind of thick branches that come out, and then which branch into little smaller branches known as dendrites. Okay, the dendrites are just little branches. So, I suppose if you think about it, it's important to have all these little dendrites because this is where we're going to detect a electrochemical impulse. It's going to be passed on to these little branches. So they're almost like I don't know, aerials or something, like that you'd have for TVs, where you're trying to, have this kind of rod here that's here to detect like electrochemical impulses. So we've loads of these little rods here sticking out, trying to gather the electrochemical impulses. For example, here this might be, located here in the spine. So you're trying to detect an impulse along the spine. Okay, so this tiny, anyway, microscopic cell, that's the one side of it here, the cell body, which is, as we said, cell body containing the traditional parts we're used to, and it contains these unusual parts, dendron and the dendrites. Then you've got this connection here, so it's quite like a stretched out sort of cell. You've got this part here, which is the axon again, and this axon is effectively the conductor. Okay, so you're conducting, so once you detect a nerve impulse along here, you're going to carry this nerve impulse through the cell into the axon. Okay, so this is one cell, remember, this into this part of the cell, which is called the axon. And the axon is highly conductive to carry the electrical impulse along it. So effectively, it's impulse here. We're only talking about electrical at the moment, okay? The electrochemical, so electrical first. So the electrical impulse is being carried along here through the axon, carried from atom to atom through as electricity. It's carried here until it reaches here. These are known as terminal dendrites. And I guess if this came up on your exam and they identified the terminal dendrites for you, and asked you which direction is the impulse traveling, it'd be easy to remember it because, like in an airport, you have a terminal, and the terminal is where you leave. Okay, so here in the same way, you have terminal dendrites that the nerve impulse is going to leave these terminal dendrites, and it's going to be carried on to the next neuron then. And this is where we're going to start talking about the other part. As so I said, talked about electro. This is where we need chemicals to carry the impulse from A to B. Okay, so we're going to use something called a neurotransmitter. Okay, so a neurotransmitter, Neuro transmitter, neuro coming from neuron, and transmitter as in to transmit a message. Okay, so that kind of, I suppose, maybe went into a little bit too much detail at this stage, but what should you be able to identify here? You should be able to draw this out, draw your cell body and the branches that come out of it. The branches, for thick branches called the dendrons, smaller branches called the dendrites, okay? You have your axon, which is the yellow part. Now we have this part here, which is in blue, and this is called the myelin sheath. Okay, the myelin sheath is highlighted in blue, and effectively the comparison for this is like where you have like insulation around the cable. you have insulation around the cable because you don't want your finger to touch the cable and get electrical shock. In the same way here, as you insulate with this myelin sheet here, you insulate the nerve impulse so that to make sure that the electrochemical message is carried from A to B without losing without conducting it into other parts of the body. You don't want to lose this message, so you're going to try to insulate here with this myelin sheet here. Okay, and then you have these specialized cells. So these are tiny, absolutely tiny, which are called Schwann cells, which are SCHWANN, so Schwann cells, which are like a symbiotic relationship here, where they kind of grow here out of the motor neuron cell, and what they're going to do here is they're actually producing this. They are producing this myelin sheet. Okay, so they produce the myelin sheet. So if you can imagine here, if we find a series of motor neurons here in a row, because remember, these are microscopic, so you've got millions and millions of them in a sequence. So if we can follow the path here along, so say, for example, now the dendrites have caught an electrochemical message. They're going to carry it through the cell body, through the axon, until they reach the terminal dendrites. Once they reach the terminal dendrites, they're then going to carry the electrochemical message. It's becoming a chemical message now by the neurotransmitters, which are going to carry it along here until it hits here the dendrites of the next neuron. It then carries through the cell body, through the axon to the next terminal dendrites, and then you need neurotransmitters again to pass it across this gap. Okay, so these gaps here are known as synaptic clefts. Okay, you'll look at that in a second, but every connection here between a neuron, one neuron and the next, is called a synapse, and the actual gap itself is called a synaptic cleft. So in this case here, we're moving from left to right and continuing on here until maybe we reach the brain. Right, so that's a motor neuron, so you just need to be able to draw one of them in sequence. I think I've mentioned everything there except for maybe I didn't mention here the node of Ranvier. So this is the kind of slight little pore between the myelin sheath. So there's pores along the myelin sheath here, and any kind of gap here is called a node, node of Ranvier. Is there anything there else? There's not really. Okay, so anyways, a motor neuron is a nerve cell that carries messages from the CNS to effectors. Now, we'll be looking at effectors later, but effectors suggest that you're bringing about some sort of a response. So you're taking your message from the central nervous system to effectors. Like, for example, the effector might be like your in your skin, causing your hair follicle to go upright. That would be an effector. Or maybe you're sending it to like your just trying to think. Salivary glands would be an effector, so glands could be an effector there. Salivary glands would release a saliva. So you're sending a electrochemical message from a nerve cell to the effectors. Okay, so what I just want to focus on today is like you being able to draw this and talk about the functions of each part. So as I said, the cell body is the part that we would normally associate with a cell. It has all the nucleus, the cytoplasm, the cell membrane, the mitochondria, and ribosomes, which, and we're not going to go through those functions. Go back and look at cell structure again if you don't remember those. Function, again, it carries impulse from the dendrites to the axon. The dendrites, as I said, which are these parts, are just there to carry impulses to the cell body. So they're there to catch this electrochemical message and bring it to the cell body. The next one, then, the axon, is there simply to carry the electrochemical message from the cell body to the terminal dendrites. Okay, synaptic cleft, as I said, no, synaptic cleft would be like here between here and the next neuron. I didn't mention the synaptic knob, which is located at the terminal dendrites, these blue parts. And this is where the neurotransmitters are released. So like, for example, dopamine is an example of a neurotransmitter, the myelin sheath, which is this part which insulates the electrochemical message, and it is a lipid. That's important there as well. The Schwann cells, their function is to again produce this myelin sheath. And then, is there anything else? No. Okay. Now, what makes a motor neuron and a sensory neuron different is where the cell body is located. Okay. And again, unfortunately, you have to be able to draw this. There's a second type of cell that you have to be able to draw. And in this case here, very similar. You've got dendrites here, except for the dendrites here are kind of branches on one side of the neuron. And then they go directly into the axon, so there's no cell body located here whatsoever. However, the cell body in a sensory neuron is found on either side of, like, up or down on the axon itself. So anywhere along here is where you'd find the cell body, or here. The synaptic knobs, as I said, they produce a neurotransmitter. So the terminal dendrites are still here. So it's basically the cell body just located in a different place, and there's no like dendrites coming out of this whatsoever. Interneuron. Interneuron is there to carry messages between nerve cells. So actually, did I go through the function of this? I didn't. Sorry. The sensory neuron is a nerve cell carrying messages to the CNS from a sense organ. So any sensory neuron there, like again, photoreceptors, chemoreceptors, mechanoreceptors, are sensory neurons that are sending messages to the CNS, so the central nervous system. So you're trying to send the message to the brain and the spinal cord, basically to ask for a response. Okay, the interneurons are carrying messages between nerve cells. Okay, so between different types of nerve cells, like neurons and sensory neurons, and the cell body here in an interneuron is actually found in the middle of the neuron. So this one here, it doesn't have any myelin sheath, and that makes it unusual as well. So again, you have to be able to draw this one. These interneurons, though, note that they are only found in the central nervous system. Right. I think the best thing you can do at this moment in time is write down a few notes based on what I was on this screencast. I would like you to sit down and practice drawing the motor neuron, the sensory neuron, the interneuron, learn off their functions, learn off what the peripheral nervous system is and the central nervous system. And then in your book, hopefully it has something about transmission in your book, and read about transmission of electrochemical messages from your book, or maybe your Revise Wise, it'll have something on that. Okay, and then what we'll do is we'll continue with that tomorrow.